talking about metacognition, and I've subtitled the talk Theory and Practice for the Classroom, because I do think that it's important that we get into the weeds a little bit and understand what these words and ideas mean in theory, because then teachers can apply them from first principles rather than just sort of talking about tools and strategies, which are kind of useful, but without that deep understanding, then we can't adapt them in the same way. So here's the sort of general gist of what I'm going to talk about. This is going to be a talk in 3 parts, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end if I get through it all. First of all, this idea of the learning skills curriculum, which is the central theme of that book that Luke mentioned. And that was my entry into learning to learn, really. And so I'll just briefly share with you my experience in this world of learning to learn and immersed in these ideas for the last 10 years or so. Then we'll get into the theory. And I want to talk about 2 different conceptions of metacognition, a narrow conception and a broad conception, because that's an important distinction to make. And then I want to be really clear about what these words mean. What's the difference between self-regulation and metacognition and self-regulated learning? Because there's some important distinctions to draw there. And then in the final part of the talk, I'll talk about some practical strategies, and these are applicable right across the age range, really. There is, we work with people in early years, people in adult education. So these are applicable across the range. I hope you will agree. So we'll start with the learning skills curriculum, and as I say, there's this book that we've written, and at the end of this session, I've got a spare copy of the book, which will there'll be a prize that goes to one person who answers the magic question correctly. So keep your eyes peeled for that at the end of the session. So let's dive in. The learning skills curriculum, I sort of entered this world of learning to learn 10 years ago, in 2010, in fact, 11 years ago, when I received an email from my head teacher asking who wants to be involved in designing and teaching a learning to learn course. And it started with year 7. We would have 5 lessons a week with the whole of year 7, and we could do with that time whatever we wanted, which is a remarkable, opportunity. We have 1/5 of their time. And then when that first cohort went into year 8, we had 3 lessons a week in year 8, and then again into year 9. So over 3 years, these kids had over 400 lessons of learning skills, which is incredible. And we did different things in each of those years, but it was the same sort of theme. It was teaching them how to get better at learning stuff. We also had embedded elements across the curriculum, because you can't just teach these things in isolation. They have to sort of be joined up across the piece. And this is more of a concern at secondary than primary. So we had sort of shared pedagogical strategies. We had a joined up approach to CPD. And then thirdly, we had strategies for transfer, because again, even when you've got timetable lessons and when you've got stuff happening across the piece, you still need to make really clear how you're going to translate and transfer the knowledge and skills and really dispositions. It's almost like character development at its most fundamental level, having a disposition towards curiosity or to being able to feel comfortable with being uncomfortable, for example, and how to translate those out of the learning skills lessons, out of the learning skills classroom and into subject learning across the piece. And these things are relevant at primary as well when you're doing some sort of explicit learning to learn stuff, but then you need to think, well, how is this helping us when we do maths or French or art or PE or music or whatever? So I studied this. I realized early on that this was an amazing opportunity, and I wanted to capture it in the most robust way that I could think of. So I signed up to do a PhD, and that turned out to be an 8-year study, because I followed 4 cohorts of students from year 7 through to year 11. And we were really looking as the primary outcome measure in how are they doing in their subject learning across the piece. And to cut a long story short, there were significant gains. Those kids went on to achieve the best set of results that that school had ever seen by some margin across the curriculum. And in particular, it was beneficial for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So this was in a school in an area of high disadvantage. And the gap closed hugely. So at GCSE, the disadvantage gap closed by over 65% from one cohort to the next, which was amazing. And as I say, this was piloted in a secondary school, but we've since implemented it in a whole range of contexts, as I said earlier, from early years to universities, schools in deprived areas to elite international colleges. We've taken it into workplaces and refugee camps. And this is also really relevant. These key ideas of metacognition and self-regulation and oracy, this is also what makes for really effective professional development for teachers as well. So we can learn from this as well. Most recently, I'm working with an SEMH school, which is really interesting. And Kate now lives in the Dominican Republic. She got stuck there during lockdown last year and ended up setting up a school, a sort of a learning to learn school, which opened a few weeks ago, which is going really, really well. The kids are complaining. The parents are complaining that when it's weekend, the kids are complaining. Some of them are in tears because there's no school on a Saturday, and so that's a good problem to have. Okay, so that's a quick sort of whistle-stop tour through my entry into this world. So I know that these ideas work in all kinds of ways, and it's not just about improving exam results, but that was the sort of the headline figures. So let's get into the theory. This idea of narrow versus broad conceptions is really important, and I don't think that the narrow conception is bad. I don't just think that it's only part of the story. So the narrow conception, I think, is summed up quite neatly in the EEF's guidance that you can see here, their guidance around metacognition and self-regulated learning, where they're talking about things like the students understanding their strengths and weaknesses in a particular subject, helping them develop tools to remember, how to spell. So there's a little vignette in that guidance where there's a student called Freya who's got this weekly spelling test, and she's struggling to spell certain words, and she teaches herself mnemonic strategies, and lo and behold, she does better in spelling. And it's focused on things like study skills and exam techniques, this narrow conception. And this is all really good. We want kids to be able to spell and to not be confounded by exam questions. But there's this broader agenda here, which I think is important to recognize. And this was the case very explicitly right from the outset. So this is John Flavel, and this is an excerpt from a piece that he wrote. This is a guy who invented the word metacognition, a developmental psychologist. He wrote a really influential piece in 1979 called Metacognition and Cognitive Monitoring, where he concluded that paper by saying that the ideas currently brewing in this area could someday be translated into ways of teaching kids and adults to make wise and thoughtful life decisions, as well as to learn better in formal educational settings. So I think it's important to recognize that there's this broader agenda here, which is about sort of like developing young people and helping them grow as people, helping them to sort of self-actualize, to become more fully themselves, to develop a stronger sense of identity. And that's the sort of the side of things that I'm at least as interested in, if not more so, than in the narrow conception. So I think it's important to make that distinction. Excuse me 1 second. There's actually a horrible red flashing line around the screen. I'm just going to unscreen it and see if it goes. Yeah, no, it's back. Never mind. So defining the terms then, like, what do these words mean? Metacognition and self-regulation. Why do they seem to be sort of joined at the hip? They so often go around together. What's the difference between them? What are the areas of overlap? And there's a lot of confusion within the teaching profession. When I work with schools, they often, what am I getting? Sharing is paused until you return to the shared window. Can you see this okay? Can somebody just unmic and say?
Yes, we can see it. Yes.
Okay, I'm getting weird messages.
And the red line means that your screen's sharing. It's telling you that it's working.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. It's just very flickery. Anyway, I'm fine. So it's not surprising that there's confusion within the teaching profession, because there's a lot of confusion within the research community as well. There was a review done by Dinsmore et al. In 2008, where they looked at loads and loads of articles where these words had been talked about, and only in around half of them did the researchers even bother to offer a definition. And where those definitions were provided, there were lots of areas of difference as well as areas of overlap. And so, researchers haven't got a really clear, unified idea about what these words mean. So I've sort of done a bit of work on this, and going back to the original papers, if we go back to that paper by Flavel, he said, as I said, he was a developmental psychologist. So he said that young people learn how to control their thinking by monitoring what they know and what they think about people, tasks, and strategies. And that's important, about knowledge and thinking. So these are like objects of cognition, objects of what's going on in our minds, in our thoughts, in our thought processes. And Chris Watkins, who was at the IOE, who's brilliant and done such a lot of work in this area, really valuable stuff. He describes metacognition similarly as awareness of thinking processes and control of such processes. So again, monitoring and control. So my simplified definition is metacognition is monitoring and controlling your thought processes, and we'll look at what this looks like in practice later on. In terms of self-regulation, a lot of what we know about self-regulation comes from the work of Albert Bandura, and from his brilliant book in 86, he talked about how self-regulation is more about the process of influencing the external environment. So if metacognition is about what's in your head, self-regulation is more about what's happening in the way that you interact with the outside world through your emotions and your behaviors. And Dinsmore et al. Basically echoed that in their review that I mentioned earlier. And so my simple definition of self-regulation is that it's monitoring and controlling again, but this time it's monitoring and controlling our feelings, and that could be physical feelings or emotional feelings, and our behaviors. And lastly, self-regulated learning, because if you think about it, metacognition, monitoring and controlling your thought processes, that's huge. You could think about your cat, your holidays, your future. It's huge. It's not just about schoolwork. Likewise, your feelings and emotions, that's vast. And so very simply, without going through, you can see these quotes here, but without going through them, self-regulated learning is the application of these two ideas to learning. And that comes through quite clearly in these quotes by Schunk and his earlier work with Ertmer, that this is about applying these thoughts, feelings, and actions, behaviors to our learning. And that, so in a sense, self-regulated learning sort of overlaps with those two other ideas, but it's kind of smaller because it focuses in on learning itself. And so here's a recap. Metacognition, monitoring and controlling our thought processes. Self-regulation, like the mirror image, if you like, but this is monitoring and controlling how we interact with the external environment through feelings, emotions, and behaviors. And self-regulated learning is the application of these ideas to learning. And as I say, I do think it's important to go into this theory, because once you understand this, once you get that it just all boils down to monitoring and control, then it allows you to adapt your practice in lots of different ways. And it's important, the sequence as well, they sort of go back and forth, monitoring and control, but the monitoring sort of comes first, and through paying attention, through noticing your thought processes. If, for example, you often find a kid often finds that they think, I'm rubbish at maths, and they tell them that, if you teach them to notice that as a thought, and then they're like, oh, okay, I'm telling myself that, I wonder if I could think something else. I wonder if I could change the script. And so then they learn where the levers are, they learn where the controls are, and they can change how they think about maths. So monitoring sort of leads to control, if you like. Okay, that's the theory done, and we're about halfway through, which is good. So let's get into the practicalities of what this stuff looks like in the classroom. First of all, it's worth thinking about what we're aiming for here. There's a really good excerpt from a paper by Bob Zimmerman. I'll just read this out because I think it's great. He says that self-regulated learners are proactive in their efforts to learn rather than reactive. I talk about this with my son all the time. Like it's okay to do your homework and to do what's expected of you by the teacher, but if you really want to do well, then you need to be on the front foot and you need to attack it and be proactive. So they're proactive in their efforts to learn because they're aware of their strengths and limitations. So there's knowledge of self, because they're guided by personally set goals. That's dead important. So the goals are set by the kids and not given to them by teachers or parents, or at least they're co-constructed. And task-related strategies. These learners monitor their behavior in an ongoing way and reflect on their increasing effectiveness. And this leads to this sense of like self-satisfaction, and that fires them on to want to do more. So this is beautiful, isn't it? This is what we all want for every kid, to be in this virtuous cycle where they're learning so effectively in a self-regulated way, and it makes them feel really good, like they're growing as people, and it makes them want to go around that cycle again and again and again. So how do we get to this lovely sort of self-sustaining cycle? Well, we'll give it a go. It's a tall order, but we'll give it a go. Here are those three areas, and I'm going to share two tools from each, and there's many more. The biggest chapter in that book is chapter 5. It's like, I don't know, 100 and odd pages long, and it's dense with loads of practical strategies. So I'm just picking out a few key ones here. So metacognition, first of all, this is not so much a strategy, it's just a key insight, that it's about focusing on the how of learning as well as the what of learning. This is not an instead thing. The what, the knowledge is important, but how we learn process is important, and where you strike the appropriate balance between the what and the how is really down to each individual teacher, according to what they're comfortable with and what the young people are comfortable with. But through focusing on the how as well as the what, if we go up to that, the sentence in that bubble there, this is about taking what are often invisible, intangible, sort of tacit, implicit processes of learning. Like there's sort of, you can't see what's going on in some kids' head. If there's a student in a class who just gets it, they're quiet but really smart, and they just get stuff all the time, what are they doing in their head? There's a process at work. There's always a process at work. What are they doing in their head, and how can we lift the lid on learning to find out what they're doing with their sort of mental little ways of manipulating mental objects? So we draw them out into the light by focusing on the how. We make them visible, explicit, tangible, and therefore learnable. So what this looks like in the classroom is just talking, writing, thinking about learning, not constantly, but regularly in little short bursts. And it's asking questions like, when we learned this thing today, what were you actually doing when you learned that thing? Was it when you were talking with your partner? Did you read it? Were you looking over your notes? Did you ask a question and the answer just popped into your head before anybody had even answered it? So it's almost like you knew the answer. Were you listening to someone else? And again, if you just come back to those two ideas, monitoring and control, so you're asking them, like, what does effective learning look like? And we'll see this in the next example as well. And then how can we get better at that? How can we all learn to get better at that? And here's an example of what that might look like in practice. So think alouds are great. And this is just very simply thinking out loud. It's sort of like eavesdropping on somebody's thinking or on your own thinking. So first of all, you would start this by the teacher models this. So maybe when they're reading a complex text, they might break it down, maybe using a visualizer or breaking down the spelling of a word, whatever it is, so that they are articulating the mental process that goes into doing whatever it is that they're doing. And then the students practice it. This is traditional. So sometimes learning to learn gets tarred with the sort of the progressive brush, as though this is somehow woolly-minded and child-centered. But the way you teach this stuff is very traditional. It's like the teacher models it, you explain what you're doing, the kids practice it, you give them feedback. It's like you could call it progressive ends through traditional means. So the kids practice it, and they can do that in a low-tech way, like in pairs, like we see here, with a sheet of paper and a pen. Or you can use apps. There's a really good app called Explain Everything for those schools that have got iPads or other similar devices, where if let's say a kid is working through a maths problem, they record audio as well as writing, and then the teacher gets to see not just what they've written, but what was going on in their head as they were writing that. So you get a real insight. So this approach really helps students to see and to mimic and internalize these effective processes of learning. And it's really useful for kids and teachers, so the teachers can see inside their students' minds in the way that Explain Everything allows you to do. And it's also really useful for the students themselves, especially to learn from one another. And sometimes they got quite weird. I taught a student once. She was predicted a D and got an A star. I asked her how she did it, and she just made up little songs to herself. She found it really useful, and I do this now sometimes. Like if I really want to remember something, if it fits into the rhythm of a sort of a song that you already know, you just slot the words in, and it just sort of, it's like your neurons sort of fuse these two things together, and it just sticks. It's like magic. So we can all learn from one another in this way. Okay, self-regulation. I was quite late to this. I used to think of self-regulation in terms of self-regulated learning, like setting goals and figuring out strategies and stuff. But what's really missing often is the emotional aspect. This is why the book is called Fear is the Mind Killer. Like at root, helping kids to get better at learning stuff is a complex endeavor, because it's simultaneously cognitive, like what they know and think. It's metacognitive, what they think about that stuff. It's emotional, it's social, it's behavioral. Like it's really, there are many layers to this onion, and at root, kids have an emotional response to learning. If they've got a certain, if that kid says, they don't like maths, say, and then when they see that maths is coming up on their timetable, or they think they're bad at maths, then they might have an emotional response to that. They might just feel that their body language might drop, their jaw might be clenched, maybe they've got a jittery leg because they're sort of nervous, whatever it is. And so you can put them into their bodies. So like, what's going on? And again, sorry to sound like a stuck record, but monitoring and control. So noticing how you are responding to a situation. How does it feel? We'll look at some questions in a little while. How does it feel when things are too difficult and you feel overwhelmed and you don't really know? What's it like? What's it like when you don't know what to do? How does that feel in your body? How does it feel in your mind? And then taking action in some way to get back in the zone. And the zone's an interesting idea, because it's like this thing that we all understand that it exists. Like, oh, sorry, sir, well, I'm just not in the zone today. Or like, wow, you guys are really in the zone today. We sort of know what the zone is, but it's quite sort of ill-defined. It's just like it's a place that you want to be. And sometimes kids can be zoned out, can't they? Or they can be really hyper, and there's just sort of too full of like weird ideas in their heads to really sort of be able to listen. Or maybe they're sort of, like hypo, so they're really sort of, like just wanting the earth to swallow them up if they're really nervous, and they're sort of, just trying to make themselves really small. So it's about tuning into how things make us feel, and then using what we refer to in the book as manual override levers. So you can just override, if you're telling yourself negative self-talk about stuff, you can notice that, and then you take action. So it might be that you have a little bit of positive self-talk, or you do some sort of visualization, or you do listen to a song, or whatever it might be. So do something to sort of just to calm yourself down. And the mind, so the three levers are the mind, the body, and the breath. Breathing exercises are so powerful. People often say things like take a deep breath, don't they? But take a deep breath, like it's not really going to do very much. But if you sort of do 10 breaths, so you can talk about smooth breathing. Like if you ever listen to your breath, it's often quite juddery. You sort of go like that. And so if you tell the kids to breathe really smoothly, there's this fascinating idea called heart rate variability, HRV, that lots of very high performance athletes and business people do. If you breathe in a really smooth way, it can bring you into a peak state of mental awareness and acuity very, very quickly. And also like long in breaths and short out breaths, or turning that around. Like at nighttime, before you go to sleep, you often do a really long out breath. And that's sort of your body's sign of saying, like, it's safe here. I feel safe to go to sleep. So if a kid's feeling freaked out, if you tell them to do a few short in breaths and long out breaths, it's like that's sending us a message to their nervous system that things are okay, that they're safe, and that they can, relax and stop, being hypervigilant and freaked out by whatever's going on. And lastly, in the body, if a student is nervous about doing a presentation, saying they've got butterflies in the stomach, you can help overcome that just by stretching that part of your body. Or if your jaw's really clenched, just, loosen it, shake it out, do some sort of physical activity. Lots of personal coaches, people like Tony Robbins and these personal coaches, they always say it starts, whatever problems you're going through in life, if you're going through a divorce, if you're in debt, your business is on the rocks, whatever it is that's happening, put yourself into your body, change your physical stance, do those power postures and all that cheesy stuff. It really, really works. Because when you do all of these things, the mind, the body, and the breath, it's all about putting you in the moment, brings you into the now. And in the now, there's very rarely anything, like there's not a tiger in the room that's about to eat you. And so it sort of calms you down. It stops you worrying about the future or ruining over the past. So that's the good stuff. The 7-day challenge is one of the favorite things that I ever did with kids. I'll be really, really quick on this. If you follow that URL, tinyurl.com/scaryguy123, that's this guy here, a former sort of Hell's Angels dude who as you can see, has got these crazy tattoos all over his face. And he sort of had this epiphany and started doing all this interesting work with schools. And he talks about a 7-day challenge where you have to go 7 days without saying a negative word about another person. It's fascinating, even very young children, and that includes saying like, "Oh, miss, will you tell him he's annoyed me or something?" If you like, it's so interesting. Polite, mild-mannered kids, who wouldn't say boo to a goose, they crumble after 1 day. They can't do it, and it's so interesting. Again, monitoring and control. They notice that their brother winds them up, and then they start to behave differently around their brother. They might say, "Oh, you look nice today," or "Can I get you something?" They've changed the way that they behave. They develop strategies, or if they're freaked out, they go upstairs and scream into a pillow rather than calling someone a rude word. So really interesting, and it takes 7 days, but you can refer back to that so many times in the future. Draw breath. Lastly, I'm going to look at self-regulated learning, and there's two things here: questioning and the weekly review. So in terms of questioning, I'll look at those three things: monitoring and controlling thought processes. So these are some examples of questions, and if you want, my email address will be at the end. If you want a copy of these slides, all these questions are all in the book. I'm happy to send you a copy. So what beliefs do you have about yourself and your ideas? Do you ever find yourself thinking, I can't do this, or I'm rubbish at this? Or do you think, I can't do this yet? What do I need in order to move forward? What tools or strategies can help people to organize their thinking? And have you ever tried any of these? Have you got, like loads of kids say, I've got a really bad memory, but that's not true. Memory, loads of people can get really, really good if they learn how to use their memory. So that's an interesting thing. These bottom two questions are good as well. What's the difference between concentrating and becoming absorbed? Is it possible to force yourself to concentrate or to become absorbed? Again, you're just asking these gentle probing questions, and this could be scattered throughout. It could be that you'll start and bookend the day or bookend a lesson using these kinds of questions. So you're just engaging that metacognitive level where they're noticing and controlling. Self-regulation is split out into feelings and behaviors. So in terms of feeling, you're like, what does it feel like when you're doing something that's really hard? What does that feel like? What's it feel like in your mind? What does it feel like in your body? Is there a difference between those things? What does it feel like when you find it difficult? What do you feel like when you finally get something that you've worked at for ages? What's it feel like to lose control? All that sort of stuff. Are people able to respond to their feelings, or are feelings just something that happens, and that they are not in control of it? So asking questions around feelings, similarly asking questions around behaviors. Are you impulsive, or are you good at controlling your behavior? How good are you at managing distractions, either in the classroom or at home? If you're doing homework and you've got your phone on and it's notifications going off every 10 seconds, it's not surprising that you're going to struggle to concentrate there. Like at our house, we've got a lockable box and my son's phone goes into it at certain times of the day, and then that's taken care of, and we agreed that that's not imposed. He knows the code to the box, not me. Goal setting and so on. Okay. And then lastly, the self-regulated learning bit, like what have you learned today? What were you doing? Those questions that I asked before, what were you doing when you learned X? And again, how does it feel when you know how you've learned something difficult? So again, you're talking about feelings here, but you're applying it to learning. How can you tell when you can trust the source of information you find online? That, goodness me, the world could do with a bit more of that at the moment. Is it possible to get better at learning? Is it possible to get worse at learning? That's an interesting question. And then very finally, the last tool I'll look at is the weekly review. It's monitoring and control again, I'm afraid. It's a very consistent message. And this is a Janus-faced process, right? Looking back and then looking forward. So looking back at the last week, what did you learn about? What did you learn about yourself? What did you find easy or boring or fun or amazing or inspiring? What did you find frustrating? What surprised you? What might you do differently if you lived the last week again? And how might it have turned out differently? And so that's the monitoring bit. And then we're looking ahead to control what's coming up this week, or here's what's coming up this week. What do you expect you'll find challenging this week? What do you have? What don't you have? What do you need? What can you do to prepare yourself for this week? What different strategies might you try? And again, these questions can focus on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So you're crossing that metacognition, self-regulation divide.